Icinga and integrating it with a quite useful open source tool that's called Guacamole. And what that integration, or integrating these two applications, does give you quite an advantage when it comes to resolving incidents, because the less sort of manual work you have to do connecting to different systems when you see alarms somewhere, the less time you end up spending just on sort of mundane tasks that you need to do anyway. So I work as a senior consultant at a company called Redbridge. I used to work at a company called Opstis, but Redbridge bought Opstis, just in case you wonder why the company name has changed. And my personal philosophy is often that simpler is better, and generally speaking, of course. And user-friendliness is also kind of a very essential part of it, because you want to be able to have IT to be able to reach as many people as possible. And before coming to Redbridge, or before Opstis was bought out, I was working exclusively of observability, but that's largely my focus now as well, with all kinds of different open source observability tools. And I've worked with several different types of IT environments, large environments, very small environments. So the sort of needs have differed quite a bit through the years. But that's given me a perspective on how each customer is unique, and those requirements can't always be translated directly from one company to another. And I've worked on call as well, so that gives me somewhat of a perspective on what sort of things can happen during on-call hours, especially during the night. And in addition to that, I love true crime and anything investigative. And the reason why I bring this up is because often I want to figure out in IT, why do certain things happen, and what is the sort of the user behavior, the human psychology behind how you handle incidents. And just a little short bit about Redbridge. We're a Swedish company based in Stockholm, and we have a pretty heavy focus on open source technologies. It's almost exclusive to that. And we do a lot of IT operations, consulting, and then software development. And we were one of the first companies in Sweden to really take open source seriously when, in the beginning of the 2000s, Red Hat came to the market. Not a lot of other companies were really interested in focusing a lot of time and resources on that. So let's talk about a typical incident flow when you're on call. First, you'll get an alert from a system. Then you'll start up your VPN, because you're obviously not at the office at that point, always. That, of course, depends on the customer. And then you log into your monitoring system, often to get some sort of background information, but not always. And then you retrieve some credentials for affected systems, especially if you don't have any sort of directory service on the affected server or service. And then you log into the system, you investigate the issue, and then you resolve the issue, hopefully. And naturally, this will differ depending on which organization is in question. But imagine doing this at 2 a.m., which I've done a few times, and that's usually when a lot of mistakes happen, or it's more likely that that happens, depending on, of course, on what sort of SLA you have. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the sort of the effects of the pandemic, which is everybody knows by now. But what I found was interesting, that I saw several customers having an issue where they were not at all expecting people to be working from home. They were just expecting that everything was going to be business as usual. So suddenly, when everybody started working from home, nobody was able to log into the VPNs and their virtualized desktops, which are quite common nowadays. They were overtaxed, so nobody was able to log in, or the resources were just completely sort of overrun. And often had to do with the fact that there weren't enough licenses available. Be that in as far as VPNs go, or then some sort of virtual desktop, virtualized desktop environment. So then if we go more into detail about incidents, often they can be quite time critical. And then you end up using a bunch of different tools to try to resolve the issue: SSH clients, remote desktop, web browsers, web interfaces, and so on. And often, then when you have a support team, on-call team, you have to onboard everyone and everybody. And in a typical environment, you have to get everybody configured with all the different profiles that are needed and all the possible connections that you'll need, which can be at times very time-consuming, especially in the onboarding phase. And then when it comes to VDIs, the most common, I've seen quite a few organizations that use VDIs, meaning virtualized desktop infrastructure, to allow remote connections to their server, and they have all kinds of reasons for this. Often can be security related, that they don't want people to be connecting in with their normal clients, so they can so any sort of malware that you might have on your computer might be able to then connect directly to a server without any sort of hindrance. So I've seen this being used as some sort of a firewall or a sort of a VPN client is what I've even heard some customers call it. But when it comes to on-call, it's not quite the best solution, because they can be quite expensive, and they're very resource intensive. Use a lot of CPU and memory. And of course, this, depending on the organization, this may have a larger or smaller impact. But I've seen that even in larger companies, this is often an issue anyway. So overall, they can be quite overkill to use Citrix or VMware Horizon to remotely connect to servers, which have other ways to get to them as well. And what's especially an especially interesting challenge is when you have MSPs, meaning managed service providers, where you have a service provider that has many different customers, and those customers may have been brought in at different times into the sort of environment that the service provider has, meaning that they have often legacy requirements, so they may even have overlapping networks and so on, and different regulatory requirements, GDPR or HIPAA or PCI sort of payment card issues and so on. And in this case, when you have those different requirements, often you run into a situation where your directory services, meaning the way that you log into these different servers, can differ. You may not even have your own credentials to log in. And then there's other authentication requirements also that may come into play, like one-time passwords and multi-factor authentication as well. So here's a pretty common setup for an MSP, at least the ones that I've seen, or any sort of security conscious organization. Often you'll have your remote client, somebody that is, for example, sitting in doing on-call, or then working this IT service desk, and then you have a bunch of different tenants or segments in your network, and then you end up jumping through a bunch of jump hosts in order to get to your hosts that are behind it. And I've even seen cases where you do these sort of double hops, that you jump through one jump host and then you jump to another jump host, and then from there you're able to connect to your services or the affected servers. So what is my sort of proposed solution to this sort of Citrix and VMware as an alternative? It's a project or a software called Guacamole. It's an Apache software foundation project. And basically what it is it's a remote desktop gateway, meaning that it takes the place of Citrix or then VMware Horizon, not of course replacing all the functionality, but providing a much simpler sort of a user experience and sort of an installation experience as well. And many of you may be familiar with NoVNC, which is a similar solution which is used by a lot of the cloud, public cloud providers. And this is basically, it has a lot of the same functionality, but then it's added a bunch of protocols and different authentication mechanisms. So it's not so much something that you use as a library or just an accessory, but something that you can use directly within as a standalone solution or integrated into something existing. And with this solution, you're able to connect to VNC hosts or remote desktop hosts, or use SSH or Telnet, or even Kubernetes if you have an environment like that, which is becoming more and more common. And because it's open source, it's quite flexible. You're able to implement your own authentication backends or implement your own database where all these connections, your connection pools are sort of defined. So it's very software defined in some ways. And it also has a lot of logging that can be done, meaning recording your sessions. For example, if you want to be able to go back and see what has been done previously on a server, then you can play a video recording, seeing all the steps that were taken and all the commands that were used. So that can be quite useful afterward. So when it comes to architecture, it's quite simple. It's something that you can run within a container or then directly on a traditional server or a virtualized server. And it's basically comprised of two parts. The Guacamole servlet, which is an HTML5 front end, and then you have the back end, which is guacd. I guess it means guacamole daemon, and that is actually responsible for connecting to things. So the front end actually doesn't have responsibility for any of the protocols, but the back end is able to connect, depending on whether it has support for the back end, into the actual service. So why should you integrate this with Icinga? Well, to save time for one, and also because Icinga is, as far as I see it, is very much about integration and getting different sort of data sources into your system, be it by importing using Director, or then providing sort of a point where you can jump to another system to see more details. And it also, because of this, the Director functionality, they're able to also automate this linking. So, for example, because of the fact that you don't have because you have a satellite architecture that can be used in Icinga, and you can have different satellites and different customers. For example, if you look at this previous image, then you're able to also spread these Guacamole hosts or servers to different jump hosts, and then implement that intelligence for the linking in Director. And I think that the biggest advantage is that often when it comes to onboarding, when you have a software that's on your PC, you do have to configure it every time, meaning that all your different endpoints have to be configured. Of course, you can normally do some sort of an import or export from some tool, but that isn't always, you don't always produce a very uniform result, so that this allows you to do that very easily, because every user will be able to see the same details depending on which group they're assigned. So let's just go to a short demo. if I can get this. So here you have a sort of a typical Icinga view, showing status of different services and hosts. So if I wanted to now connect to my Windows 11 host, I've been able to add links here automatically, which then connect to a try that again. So now I'm able to connect directly to the affected or the selected server. That can be quite handy because then you don't end up having to open another client. And of course, when you have an open source tool, you do have also the freedom to then combine it with other functionalities, such as these sort of links that directly open a traditional RDP client. But because you're able to put all the configuration into Guacamole, then you're able to directly put all the correct settings and all the correct network drives and so on directly. And the advantages for this, I didn't need to do very much configuration actually. I was able to just merely add a navigation item, which is quite handy if you don't want something that automatically will require more sort of extensions or modules and so on. And this is, of course, because this is implemented in Icinga, you're able to also filter it out based on what sort of custom variables and what sort of other properties your hosts have. Yes. So that was, let me just close this window here. Yes, and that was about it for the demo. Do you have any questions?
Pretty cool. Yeah, you can raise your hands, but I have one question to ask before you do. Did anyone know about this before, Guacamole? Okay, that's quite a lot. I've never heard of it. It's kind of impressive. Dave, you were the first one, I guess.
Yeah, long time user of both. And I actually recently, just last week, rewrote my Ansible role for deploying Guacamole. Just a quick plug there if you're interested. It explodes it into different VMs for scaling. But the link there, the nav link says dest equals host. Is that just the name of the Guacamole host that you're connecting to in the nav there? I didn't know you could do that.
Yes. Just
you've got the %hostname % thing in there, which is fine. So you've just plumbed in the Icinga hosts to the Guacamole host and matched the same names, and they magically work.
Yes, there's actually one.
Is there more to it?
Yeah, there's something a little slightly more to it. The fact is that in Guacamole, they haven't implemented their links in order to connect to a specific resource. They haven't actually implemented something that is just a URL or something that is very simple. They've actually just done some sort of base 64 magic with null bytes and so on. But I was able to implement it in about 3 lines in JavaScript to do this. So basically, in order to make that connection, you can very easily just make a page in between that handles all those links by just giving putting the information in directly. But you could, of course, implement this in Director as well by having it run some sort of, importing the data from a database or something.
Just because of curiosity, so how the file transfer works? You said you just can download files also through the HTML client?
Yes, it has a little. I can actually just open up the browser again just to see.
So if we have the time, I don't know, we have 7 minutes.
So actually, when you press a certain extension, I mean, certain keyboard shortcut, you'll get a menu here on the side, which will let you use the keyboard and so on, and it'll even let you change the mode of the input, so you can use this on a tablet, for example. So if you compare this to something like Citrix, you can't necessarily run that on a Chromebook, although I'm sure that there's some plugin out there that does that, but with this, it's pure HTML5.
But you can download a file this way. Right?
Yes, it'll show up here at that point. Yeah, it's a SFTP connection and so on.
Okay.
So.
Thanks.
Do we have any other questions for this topic? Yep.
Is there the possibility to spawn a terminal on a Linux, or do I only get Windows-based UI interfaces with Guacamole?
As I mentioned earlier, it uses VNC and then it uses RDP as well as Telnet or SSH. So all of those are supported there. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have something called, I think it's quite common in the Red Hat world nowadays when it comes to remote connections to use Spice, but it doesn't have support for that specifically. Yeah, I think that there's something, when I tried to look it up, there was a mailing list question about that somebody was implementing it, but I haven't seen it implemented so far. It's been a year or two since that. Any other questions?
All right. Thank you very much for this presentation.